Politicians in the United States love to demonize their adversaries as so-called rogue states. This term was originally popularized back in the 1990s and 2000s, and US politicians claimed that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea were dangerous rogue states that threatened international norms. More recently, in the 2020s, American hawks have tried to revive this term and claimed that Russia, Iran, and Venezuela are rogue states that are threatening international peace and violating the so-called rules-based international order. But there's a very big problem with this narrative, which is that when you objectively look at the countries around the world, there is one country that violates international law more than every other country. There is one country that wages more wars than all of the other countries in the world, and that is the United States. This is why the renowned historian and journalist William Bloom published a book titled Rogue State about the USA. It was subtitled A Guide to the World's Only Superpower. He originally published it in 2000, and he updated it with a few different editions in the 2000s. And William Bloom used US government documents to make a list of all of the countries around the world where the US military and the CIA had intervened. And he showed how the US truly is the world's worst rogue state. Now, William Bloom unfortunately passed away, so I have tried to continue some of the work that he started by using US government documents to show all of the countries around the world where the US has launched military interventions. And according to US government data, the US has intervened in the vast majority of all of the countries on Earth. Again, no other country comes even remotely close. And this nonstop interventionism has been bipartisan. It doesn't matter if the US president is a Republican or a Democrat. It has been completely bipartisan over decades. And Donald Trump has taken the extremely aggressive foreign policy of the United States to a whole new level. Trump is proud of the fact that the United States is an empire. He has repeatedly promised to physically expand the territory of the US empire, and he has flagrantly threatened international institutions.
We may be a very substantially enlarged country in the not too distant. Isn't it nice to see, for years, for decades, where the same size to the square foot probably got smaller, actually. But we might be an enlarged country pretty soon.
And in December, Donald Trump demonstrated one of the US government's most blatant attacks on international law that I have ever seen. It is honestly jaw-dropping. The Trump administration is threatening the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to rewrite its statute to make an exemption for the US, so US officials can never be prosecuted for any of the crimes they committed. I'm reading here from a report in Reuters, quote, President Donald Trump's administration wants the International Criminal Court to amend its founding document to ensure it does not investigate the Republican president and his top officials. A Trump administration official said, threatening new US sanctions on the court if it did not. If the court does not act on this demand and two others, dropping investigations of Israeli leaders over the Gaza war and formally ending an earlier probe of US troops over their actions in Afghanistan, Washington may penalize more ICC officials and could sanction the court itself, the official said, end quote. So in other words, the US government believes that it is above the law, that the US should have an exemption in international law that no other country has, and that US officials should never be prosecuted by the Hague. And what's even crazier about all of this is the United States is not even a member of the International Criminal Court. The US is not a party to the Rome Statute that established the ICC in 2002. And yet the US wants an exemption because the US government constantly commits crimes in other countries, so other countries could try to use the ICC to prosecute US government officials for the crimes that they have committed against people in other countries. Just like Israel, one of the closest U.S. allies, is likewise not a member of the ICC. But Palestine is recognized as a member of the ICC, which is why Israeli officials like Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have ongoing arrest warrants against them for the crimes against humanity they committed against the Palestinian people. And the U.S. government is deathly afraid that U.S. officials could also be charged for the crimes they have committed all around the world. This is what a U.S. government official told Reuters, quote, "There is growing concern that in 2029, the ICC will turn its attention to the president, to the vice president, to the secretary of war and others, and pursue prosecutions against them. That is unacceptable, and we will not allow that to happen," end quote. So the U.S. government is threatening members of the ICC to change the Rome Statute, which would need the approval of 2/3 of the members of the ICC. Now, I should note some larger context here because it's important to emphasize that this is not at all the first time that a U.S. president has attacked the International Criminal Court. The ICC was originally founded back in 2002, and before it was founded, U.S. President Bill Clinton signed the founding treaty, and originally the U.S. was supposed to be a member of the ICC. But then George W. Bush came to power, and in 2002, his administration unsigned the founding treaty and declared that it would not be a member of the ICC. And at that time, groups like Human Rights Watch claimed that supposedly this decision would further estrange Washington from its closest allies. Of course, that's not what happened. We know that, Human Rights Watch has been very biased in the interests of the U.S. government, and they claim that the U.S. government would see the light and they would come back and support international law, which is obviously absurd. The U.S. government has never done that. In fact, just a few months later, the U.S. government escalated its attacks on the International Criminal Court, and the Bush administration passed a law known as the Hague Invasion Act. The official name is the American Service Members Protection Act, which threatened that the U.S. military will invade The Hague, the city in the Netherlands, which is where the ICC is located. The U.S. military would invade this European ally in order to physically take out any U.S. officials or government officials from U.S. allies who are being prosecuted by the ICC for the crimes they committed. Again, this is the behavior of a crazy rogue state, and this is 2002. This is well before Donald Trump became president. This all did not start with Trump. I must emphasize that. And of course, one of the main reasons that the Bush administration unsigned the ICC's founding treaty and passed the Hague Invasion Act is because the Bush administration was afraid that it could potentially face legal consequences over the illegal war of aggression that it carried out in 2003 in Iraq. The U.S. government invaded Iraq, and the UN chief at the time, Secretary General Kofi Annan, said that this was blatantly illegal and violated the UN Charter. So the Bush administration was afraid that U.S. government officials could be held accountable for the crimes that they committed in Iraq. But of course, that never happened. There has been complete impunity for U.S. government officials, despite the horrific crimes against humanity that they have committed. In fact, the Costs of War project at the elite Brown University found that the post-9/11 U.S. wars in 22 years, from 2001 until 2023, caused at least 4.5 million deaths and counting. 4.5 million deaths from these U.S. wars. This is why U.S. government officials have been so desperate in their attacks on the International Criminal Court, because they don't want to be held accountable. And I should point out, by the way, that the U.S. government has already imposed sanctions on the ICC. The Trump White House announced these sanctions just a few weeks after Trump returned to the White House for his second term as U.S. president. And in particular, the White House complained about the previous ICC investigation into U.S. military forces over the war crimes they committed in the war in Afghanistan, and also the ongoing arrest warrants for Israeli leaders. Those are the reasons cited by Trump to impose sanctions on The Hague. And then in December, the U.S. State Department announced that it had imposed more sanctions on ICC judges. And U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio made it clear that this was an act of punishment because The Hague has been trying to seek justice for the crimes that Israel has committed against the Palestinian people in Gaza. And Marco Rubio said that this would establish a dangerous precedent, and he claimed that supposedly the ICC is violating the sovereignty of the U.S. and Israel, which is outrageous. This is not a question of sovereignty. This is a question of justice for crimes committed by Israel with the support of the U.S. By the way, if we're talking about sovereignty, what about the sovereignty of the Palestinian people? Again, Palestine is a member of the ICC, and its sovereignty has been violated by the U.S. and Israel, which are carrying out crimes against humanity. And then the U.S. is sanctioning judges at the International Criminal Court to make sure there are no consequences. In case it wasn't already obvious, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights made it very clear that these U.S. sanctions against the ICC violate the rule of law. This is a blatant attack on international legal institutions, and it makes it as clear as day that the United States is a rogue regime that literally thinks that it is immune from all international law, that it has impunity, and that there should be no consequences ever for its crimes. And what's especially crazy about this is because the United States dominates the international financial system, and because U.S. big tech corporations create software used by people around the world, the U.S. sanctions on the ICC, and in particular, the ICC's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, have prevented the ICC from being able to carry out its work. So these sanctions that Trump has already imposed are not just a formality. This is not just empty rhetoric. It has had a tangible negative impact on these international legal experts. For instance, the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, he lost access to his email and his bank accounts were frozen because of these U.S. sanctions. And it's not just him. The Trump administration has already imposed sanctions on 9 staff members of the ICC, and the Associated Press noted, quote, "The sanctions can be devastating. They prevent the ICC officials and their families from entering the United States, block their access to even basic financial services, and extend to the minutia of their everyday lives," end quote. Microsoft canceled the email addresses used by ICC staff, and a Canadian staffer who works at The Hague lost access to her credit cards, and Amazon's Alexa stopped responding to her. This is like dystopian. This is the kind of thing you would see in a Black Mirror episode. This is what the US government does to people who work at the International Criminal Court because they dared to investigate the US military for the crimes it has committed in other countries. This ICC staffer said, quote, "Your whole world is restricted," end quote. This is the behavior of a rogue state, the world's biggest rogue state, because the US is so powerful that when it violates international law and sanctions international institutions, the US dominates the global financial system, which is built around the US dollar. And US big tech corporations in Silicon Valley are global monopolies. So when the US carries out these attacks on international law like this, it can destroy the lives of people around the world. And sadly, what this also means is that many countries are afraid of standing up to the US empire, this criminal rogue regime that is destroying international law. Back in Donald Trump's first term as US president in 2020, the US government again imposed sanctions on the International Criminal Court because it opened the investigation into US war crimes committed in Afghanistan. And then for public relations reasons, when the Joe Biden administration came to power in 2021, a few months into Biden's term, the U.S. State Department lifted the sanctions that the first Trump administration had imposed on the ICC. That was done by Biden's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in April 2021. So the Biden administration tried to portray itself as more responsible, claiming that it was upholding international law. And yet, 3 years later, in 2024, Blinken threatened to impose sanctions on the ICC again, just like Trump had done. And why? This time because the ICC had issued an arrest warrant for Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu over the crimes against humanity that the Israeli regime committed in Gaza with the full support of the U.S. government. So again, this is bipartisan. It's not just Trump and the Republicans. The Democrats also threatened to do the exact same thing. And the reason why is because they were afraid that if Israeli officials are prosecuted for these crimes, then U.S. government officials potentially also could be prosecuted because they're the ones who facilitated those Israeli crimes against the Palestinian people. Israel has been using billions of dollars of U.S. weapons, and the U.S. government has provided political and diplomatic support and cover for Israel, trying to ensure that it has impunity. And this was not just some isolated instance. Let's not forget that when Biden was president, the U.S. government repeatedly vetoed resolutions in the UN Security Council that called for peace and a ceasefire in Gaza. Moreover, in April 2024, when Biden was still president, the U.S. government vetoed a resolution in the UN Security Council that would have admitted Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. The vast majority of countries on Earth support Palestine becoming a UN member state. In fact, the majority of countries on Earth already recognize Palestine as a state. And yet it was the US government that was the only obstacle to preventing Palestine from being recognized by the UN as a full member. This is the definition of being a rogue state. And again, this is bipartisan. It's not just Trump. It's also Biden and Obama and George Bush and Ronald Reagan. The list goes on and on over decades. But to focus on more recent news, we saw one of the most blatant examples of how the U.S. government is a rogue state in a vote in the UN General Assembly on the 10th of December. There was a vote on a resolution that called for the safety and security of humanitarian personnel and the protection of UN personnel. This vote was 153 to 1. The United States was the only country on earth that voted against a resolution that called for protecting United Nations staff and humanitarian personnel. Again, I just don't know how to stress how much of a rogue regime the U.S. is. Literally, the U.S. is the only country voting against the entire world at the UN. And again, this is not just some isolated case that only happens under Donald Trump. Back in 2024, when Joe Biden was president, there was a vote on a UN General Assembly resolution that called for the end to the illegal U.S. embargo against Cuba. And that vote was 187 in support and 2 against it, with just 1 abstention. It was the United States and Israel against the entire world. The U.S. and Israel were the only countries that supported the illegal U.S. blockade of Cuba. Again, this is under Biden. And by the way, this is a vote that happens every year. It has happened every year for decades, and the vote has almost always looked exactly the same. The U.S. and Israel against the world. Also back in 2024, there was a vote on a resolution that called for the peaceful settlement of the Palestine question. It was 157 in support, 8 countries against, the U.S. and 7 allies voting against it. In 2023, still when Biden was president, there was a UN General Assembly vote on a resolution that called for supporting the operations of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, which is known as UNRWA. That vote was 160 in support and just 4 countries against. the US, Israel, Canada, and Micronesia, the rogue states against the world. Also in 2023, there was a vote on a resolution that called for the end to Israel's illegal occupation of Syria's Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory according to international law. That vote was 146 in support and 2 countries against, the US and Israel, the biggest rogue states on earth. And then back in 2022, there was a UN vote condemning the risk of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. This resolution called for the countries in the Middle East, in West Asia, to get rid of their nuclear weapons. It's only one country, of course, which is Israel. And the resolution expressed opposition to other countries getting nuclear weapons in the future. Iran voted in support of the resolution. Iran said, we don't want nuclear weapons. Of course, the US and Israel voted against it in a vote of just 5 countries against the resolution: the US, Israel, Canada, Micronesia, and Palau. Meanwhile, 152 countries voted in support of it. And by the way, this is not just the case with resolutions related to Israel-Palestine. For instance, another UN resolution in 2022 called for the implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity and its contribution to sustainable development. It sounds like a very uncontroversial resolution, but once again, it was the US and its allies against the rest of the world. 166 countries voted in support of the resolution. 3 countries voted against it: the US, Israel, and this time, Japan. Only 1 country abstained. That was South Korea. Of course, Japan and South Korea are militarily occupied by the US. So here we see an example of how the US and its allies are spitting in the face of international law. And we'll look at one more example here, and then I'll stop, because I could just go on all day with these examples of the US being a rogue regime. In 2022, there was a vote on another resolution that supported the role of the United Nations in promoting development in the context of globalization and interdependence. This vote was 130 in support, with just 2 against. The US and Israel, once again, although I should add that in this resolution, many Western countries, especially in Europe, abstained in the resolution. So really, it was the West against the world. I think you're now probably starting to see the pattern here. The United States is a rogue state according to any consistent definition of the term. And although the US truly is unique when it comes to violating international law more than any other country on earth and waging war all around the world, many times other Western countries also join the US rogue state in attacking international law. This includes many countries in Western Europe that, more so than Washington, do lip service to international law and what they call the so-called rules-based international order, in which the West makes the rules. But we've also seen many examples in the United Nations where the West votes together against the rest of the world, the global South versus the global North. A good example of this is whenever there's a vote in the UN General Assembly against unilateral coercive measures, which is the legal term for sanctions, which violate international law, it's consistently the West against the rest of the world. The vast majority of countries, which are represented by the global South, oppose the imposition of unilateral sanctions, whereas the Western colonial powers that colonized the vast majority of the world, they're the only countries that support the imposition of unilateral sanctions. And then we saw yet another example of this in another UN resolution in 2023 that called for the equitable geographical distribution in the membership of the human rights treaty bodies. Essentially, this resolution complained about the fact that Western countries that colonize most of the world still dominate these international human rights bodies. So this resolution, it should be uncontroversial. It said, we should have more representative membership, representing all of the countries of the world. And the Western countries opposed this because they want to continue dominating the international institutions to try to impose Western hegemony on the countries that they previously colonized. So unsurprisingly, the vote was the West against the rest of the world. And then in another UN resolution, the global North just wanted to spite the global South and the West voted against a resolution that called for human rights and cultural diversity. It was completely innocuous, but again, the West voted together as a bloc in protest of the Global South, whereas the Global South voted in a bloc against the Global North. It's so clear. We can see the division of the world so clearly. The colonial powers versus the Global South. All you have to do is look at UN General Assembly votes. I'll look at one more example here. I don't want to bore people because, again, I could just go on all day with these examples of the West being rogue states. Now, for decades, there has been a call by the Global South for a new international economic order. This goes back to 1974. The formerly colonized countries demanded the decolonization of the international financial system, which is dominated by the US and the West more broadly. And they called for international democracy in the global economic order. And every time this resolution is introduced at the UN General Assembly, the vote pretty much always looks exactly the same. It is the West against the rest of the world. It is the colonial powers trying to hold on to their privileges and denying equal rights to the Global South. And of course, it's the United States that is the leader of the Western imperialist bloc. Now, after I showed all of those examples there of this consistent pattern, there may be some critics and skeptics who say, Ben, you're just cherry picking a few examples. So if you don't believe me, here I'm going to show you some empirical research that was done by political scientists who number crunched. They looked at the data and they found that consistently large countries in the Global South like China, India, Bangladesh, and also Russia, which is, an honorary member of the Global South now. It's been kicked out of the West. They'd almost always vote together in the vast majority of UN General Assembly resolutions. Meanwhile, the US is the world's biggest outlier. The US votes no on UN General Assembly resolutions more than any other major country on earth by a massive margin. Again, this is from quantitative research published in peer-reviewed journals by political scientists. And there's another very interesting chart in this research that looks at votes in the UN and groups together according to their region. And this research shows that the Global South countries in Asia and Africa and Latin America, they tend to vote together in the vast majority of votes. There are a few outliers, but the vast majority vote together. Whereas Europe tends to vote together against the Global South, and the US is, again, a massive outlier. It's the world's biggest outlier. This is empirical evidence from social science showing how the US is the world's biggest rogue regime. The European countries also are, to a lesser degree, going against the global majority. But again, even compared to Europe, the US is just on another planet when it comes to spitting in the face of international law and being a complete rogue state. So now that I've gone through all of that evidence, I hope I've made my point very clear today. I wanted to make this analysis because I saw this crazy report about Trump threatening the ICC and demanding that it change its charter in order to make a legal exemption for US government officials so they can never be prosecuted for the crimes they have committed around the world. This is truly a shocking story, and it definitely represents a kind of new level of criminality. But the reason I wanted to make this analysis is I wanted to show to people today that this is not something unique to Donald Trump. This has been bipartisan in US politics, and this has been a problem that goes back decades. If the term rogue state means anything, if there's an actual consistent definition of the term, the United States is the world's biggest rogue state, and there is no other country that comes even remotely close. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.